Hello, students. Welcome to FPP 101. This is your crash course about how to do foundation paper piecing. Keep in mind, I'm not a professional teacher. Okay, I'm an insurance adjuster, kind of a different line of work. But you know what? I have a passion for this, and I'm more than happy to teach you what I know. I feel like it's Marge Simpson doing her piano lessons. You just have to stay one lesson ahead of the student. So let's dive into it. All about printing your project. So make sure you are printing your template at the correct size. My patterns come ready to print on your home printer at standard 8.5 by 11-inch printer paper size. And I have also included this handy measuring guide to ensure that your print job is scaled to exactly 100%. So just take out your measuring tool and make sure that that box is in fact 1 inch by 1 inch. Trust me, if it's a little bit off, you're gonna be disappointed. So just make sure that the print job is scaled to exactly 100% to get started. Now we're ready to cut out our template. So on my patterns, I include a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the outside of the blocks. This has two purposes. So for example, on my atomic starburst block, this seam allowance exists so that you can connect your block to sashing, another block, or whatever you'd like to attach this block to finish your project. Another example is for this block from my literally just a ghoul pattern, the final wall hanging is a portrait and it's made up of 16 total blocks that all get connected together. So whether it's for a finished block or for a piece of the final image, each block has the allotted 1/4 inch seam allowance to the outside. So to get started, obviously you're going to need a sewing machine. I mean, you could do this by hand, but you would be a lot stronger person than I am, but I'd recommend having a sewing machine. Your template, you'll need some fabrics. You'll need your rotary cutter, your color guide, glue stick, and a ruler of some kind where you can visually see a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So this can be a standard quilting ruler like this, where you can, visually see that 1/4 inch from above, or I have here what is called an add a quarter ruler. This is such a great tool to have for foundation paper piecing. It's totally not a need, but it's awesome. And I'll show you how that can be helpful later on. All right, let's plan out our colors. So I alluded to this in the last step that we need our color guide. So we're back in our literally just a ghoul block. In this block, we're making a portion of the portrait. So you'll see on the template that there are numbers, which represent the order that we will attach our fabrics to the template. You may have heard FPP as like sew by number, so that's what those numbers represent. And then the letters on my templates correspond to the color code. So in this particular pattern, we have a background color, which is the black and white stars. We have a white for the ghost's face. We have a black for the little outlines. And then I have P, which for me stands for like patterned. So that could be a pink. That could be whatever, like I have a gingham here. It's just kind of whatever pattern fabric you find. So in the template, I have left a handy guide where you can cut and paste your own fabrics to keep your color codes straight. And then I have left all of my pattern files in black and white so that you can really be creative with your coloring ideas and get really crazy with it. This is a great time to use up your stash and just get super creative and scrappy with all the different colors you can find. So all about the template. If you are brand new to FPP, this might look a little crazy. I promise again, we'll go over this in detail as we work, but notice again on the block there are both numbers and letters. And like I said, sew by number, that refers to the order that we attach our fabrics to the project. So you guessed it, we start with piece 1 and then move on to piece 2 and 3 and so on and so forth until we've added all of our fabrics in order. The letters you see here again refer to the color. And remember the color guide we made? The beauty of FPP is we can really take advantage of that scrap bin. So sewing such a small piece in standard piecing can be so tough, at least for me, but FPP makes it really, really easy. So something to keep in mind is that we are going to be sewing directly onto these lines. And what that means is that this pattern is actually the mirror image of what our complete block will be. So the wrong side of our fabric will be facing the wrong side of the paper, if that makes sense. Okay, we're ready. We're getting ready to sew our first seam. So start out with a fresh needle if you can. Having a sharp needle really helps us punch through the paper. We are going to lower our stitch length. Having a lower stitch length will make it so that the paper is kind of like perforated. And having a smaller stitch length, I like to do like 1.4 or 1.6 millimeters, just makes it so much easier. And then the next thing on our templates, we want to pre-fold our seam lines. This is a preference thing, but I'm actually enacting this into law because it makes your life so, so much easier. So we are starting out with piece number 1. Remember how we talked about how this is the mirror image, how this template is the mirror image of what our finished quilt block will look like? So what this means is, you guessed it, the wrong side of the fabric attaches to the wrong side of the paper. This is for piece number 1 in particular. So the first thing that we are doing is cutting out a piece of fabric that is more than large enough for section 1. We don't want to have a piece of fabric that is the exact same size as section 1. Otherwise, we will have no seam allowance to attach it to any other pieces. But I would say, as a beginner, make sure that that piece for piece number 1 is like has an inch extra. You can totally cut way more than you need just to be safe, to make it easy on yourself. But for only our first seam here, again, we're going to be sewing on line number 1, and that's how we're attaching piece number 1 and piece number 2 both together to each other and also to the template. So when we're attaching those two pieces of fabric together, we're always putting the right sides of the fabric together. I know this is a little funky and a little confusing. Just keep in mind all the basic information that you already know about sewing still applies. So if you're sewing two pieces of fabric together, the right sides of the fabric will be together. But just in review, only piece number 1 has anything to do with the wrong sides, and that's just to get the ball rolling. So we are gluing the wrong side of piece number 1 to the wrong side of the template. And then all additional fabrics will go right sides together to whatever fabric is currently on there. So we are ready to attach both piece number 1 and piece number 2 to the template. So the order of operations for FPP will be this. It'll be the same rhythm with each piece. We're going to fold, we're going to cut our 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew our seam, we're going to press, and we're going to move on to the next number. So I'll go over all these steps again in detail, but that is the basic rhythm of FPP. So look here and see that I have folded line number 1. This is our first seam. With this seam, we are attaching both of these two pieces of fabric to our template, and we are attaching them together to each other. So the first two pieces on a pattern are a little bit unique in that way. So after I get these two pieces on here, I'll discuss with you how to ensure that you have the right size of fabric to get the job done when you're adding an additional piece. I just want to get the ball rolling first. Now, we do not want to sew piece number 2 on like this. And again, I'll show you why in a moment. Once I have a finished seam and a few pieces attached to the block, this will make a lot more sense when I flip it and show you. So we are sewing our seam number 1. We're doing a few back stitches, and we are very careful to sew only exactly on that seam line. We are having the right sides of both fabric together, and then we are pressing our seam when we're done. It's up to you if you finger press or use an iron. I use an iron with no steam. Remember, we're using paper, so steam would be like a no-go. Just keep things clean. No steam with an iron is my preference. Totally up to you. All right, now you can see from the bottom why we have sewed the seam from this angle. Look at the difference between these two blocks. This is an extremely common mistake with FPP, and I have done it myself this way many times when I'm just not thinking or I'm in a rush. Essentially, we want piece number 2 to be layered directly under piece number 1 with only the seam allowance on the right side of that pre-folded line. So when we're moving on to the next seam, we're going to discuss cutting our fabrics to ensure we have a big enough piece to fit our template. And just keep in mind again that we're putting the right sides together for our fabric. So this means that when we're working on estimating our fabric size, we are laying our fabric up on our table right side up so that the right side of what we've already sewn is kind of sandwiched together with that. So I like to follow our same rhythm. I'm getting ready to do the next seam and I'm folding my fabric. I like to cut my 1/4 inch seam allowance and then begin plotting out my next fabric. That's why that add a quarter ruler comes in handy. So look here at this line. If I cut right against this line and I don't include my 1/4 inch seam allowance for my next piece, where will my next piece of fabric go? When I sew on this line, what will it be attached to? It may catch a few threads of the very edge of that piece, but ultimately I have left myself no seam allowance and no strength for my next piece of fabric to grab onto. So that is why we cut our 1/4 inch seam allowance and why this add a quarter ruler is so handy, because it butts right up against our folded piece of paper there, and I can quickly grab that 1/4 inch seam allowance and cut it. I know this has been a lot of information so far. I appreciate you hanging in there with me. We are working on mapping out our next fabric to ensure we have enough to cover the next piece of our sew by number template piece. So we've layered our fabric right sides together and we have both of them lined up with the clean seam allowance because we are not cutting our seam allowance off in this house. But hey, wait, my hands and my template are in the way. I know, but that's why pre-folding our templates is so handy. I got this great tip from my friend Kathy about how to do some undercover locator services for our next fabric. So we will lift up this piece here and locate which folded point is kind of the farthest over and is related to our next fabric. And what she showed me is hold down that farthest corner over with your nail and just kind of pin it to the table. So you're pinning your template and both fabrics to the table, and then we're lifting up the paper and the fabrics that are currently attached, everything except that bottom layer, so that we can kind of get a clue as to where the edge of our fabric is. Again, as a beginner, when we're cutting this piece, you want to add quite a bit of extra, like at least an inch, to make sure that we're covered at all angles. But of course, you can just like hold the fabric like this and eyeball it too. This is just my preferred method because I don't like to waste fabric and I find this to be the most precise. So you can see here that I'm using my current template as a guide of where I need to cut more than enough of that bottom layer to ensure I've got the coverage I need for my next piece. Now, this is beyond the hardest part, I think, of FPP. It's totally funky to get used to, but one day it will just click and this will be so easy and second nature to you. Now that I've got my next piece ready to sew, I am grabbing everything and everybody up to that sewing machine and I'm getting myself flattened out here. So I like to lift mine up to the sewing machine with my paper still folded. I lay everything down flat, get it really nice and flat, and then I will hold my template and both layers of fabric with my left hand with, decent pressure, and then I will slide my paper back open with my right. I'll get everything lined up under my presser foot, and what I like to do again is I'll put my needle down, I'll put my presser foot down, and then I check again to make sure that everything looks kind of good to go and that we're all lined up there. And the last step is just to sew the seam. There's going to be a seam ripper involved the first few times you do this. Don't be afraid to just make a mistake and seam rip it. It happens. This is a new skill that you're learning. Don't be hard on yourself. It really only clicked for me, honestly, when I went to an in-person class because I was getting so mad that I couldn't figure it out on my own. So, obviously, whatever questions you have, drop them below, and let's move on to the next piece. All right, we are keeping this train moving on the sew by number challenge. So something I'm showing you here is that I am trimming just outside of my seam allowance to keep things kind of cleaned up. And by trimming, I use the word trimming loosely because you'll find out my rotary cutter skills are just abysmal, honestly. But we're moving on to section 4. So we are following that same rhythm. We are folding along our pre-folded line. Next up, you already know what it is. We're trimming our seam allowance. So you want to make sure that your fabric from whatever was recently sewn is perfectly flat the way that it will be in the final design. Otherwise, you run the risk of accidentally trimming off something that you didn't mean to. So just make sure before you flip it to the pattern side to trim your seam allowance that the good design is already all flattened out, if that makes sense. See, this is why that add a quarter ruler is so nice. All right, so we're moving on to the next piece, and I'm going to talk about another common mistake when it comes to cutting our fabric. And this is a mistake that I actually still make all the time, which is so frustrating. So, this piece that we're looking at here, it's kind of a small and narrow piece, but it's a little bit pointy at the end. So, we're doing that trick where we're holding our nail down, but look down here. If I go to my furthest left point there, it looks like I'm totally in the clear. But keep in mind, down at the bottom, that point goes down farther. So I wouldn't have cut enough fabric if I would have cut it where I first laid it. So keep in mind, you want to be checking all angles when you are mapping out how much fabric you need to cut. And you know what's funny is I set up this scenario to show a common mistake, and I actually made a mistake while I was doing this, so I wonder if any of you will catch it before I did. But this piece of fabric here, you'll find actually has a little slit in it right about where my rotary cutter is, going horizontally, and I didn't even see it. I didn't see it at all until I picked up that piece to go and then try and sew it, and I actually had to cut another piece of fabric. So that's just what's so funny. I mean, you can be literally teaching the class and still make mistakes. So that just goes to show, quilting in general, sewing is a craft for resilient people. I mean, we all know this. Quilting can be really, really frustrating, and this is a totally different and just kind of a funky way to quilt. And so don't be down on yourself if you're having to cut something multiple times, or if you're sewing it in a weird angle, or you're making a silly mistake, because when I was sewing up my first draft of the quilt for this pattern, I made so many mistakes. Some of them were with the pattern design where I just didn't realize I had a line that went too far, but a lot of them were with the construction. This is a kind of just a funky thing to learn, but once it clicks, it'll click. So look here, we're getting ready to sew this line, and I want to show you something here up close. So I have placed my needle right at the start of the line. I am not going any further back. I'm not going forward. I want to sew on exactly where that line is. And that goes for the end of the line as well. I want to stop my needle as close as I can get it to that point. Because that section 5B there, if I sew past that line, I'm cutting into the next space, and I need that space to be free. Otherwise, I won't be able to pre-fold my paper before I do my seam allowance. So pretty much the rest of the block is just following this process, following our color chart. But keep in mind that, this is something that just takes a little time to learn. So don't be frustrated and just do your best. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to help. I'm very active over on TikTok at Tina Stitches XOXO. I have the same handle over on Instagram. And, I'm happy to help however I can, but that's essentially the gist of it. So let's go over our main rhythm. That is the most important part. What are we doing first? We're pre-folding. What are we doing next? We're cutting our seam allowance. And what are we doing after that? We are making sure that everything is all lined up really well before we sew our line, and then we're pressing, whether that's finger pressing or using an actual iron. I know people get all up in arms about pressing or whatever. It's fine. But for me, as long as you don't use steam, whatever. And keep in mind, if you print your pattern on an like a laser printer, sometimes heat will cause that ink to transfer. So only press on the fabric side if you have a laser printer. All right, well, that's pretty much it. You are now a graduate of FPP 101 Crash Course. Thanks so much for listening to me talk at you. And don't judge yourself if you have to go back and watch a couple things a few times. Again, I didn't learn this very well until I went to an in-person class. So appreciate your time today. I appreciate you purchasing a pattern from me, and I guess have fun. Good luck.